Olá, pessoal, bem-vindos ao canal Gaiata Psi e à nossa playlist O Estranho, nossa aventura em busca da verdade.
Hello, folks. Welcome to our channel. We are the Joyful Psychology and Psychoanalysis, and we are here with the Uncanny playlist. Okay, welcome, and we hope you enjoy our afternoon.
Sim, hoje é o nosso primeiro encontro internacional com o professor paranormal Loyd Auerbach.
Today is our first international encounter. So this reunion has received Mr. Loyd Auerbach, authority on parapsychology into paranormal.
And nós temos 10 perguntas para fazer ao Loyd sobre parapsicologia, que já estão pré-determinadas. Então, nós vamos ler as perguntas e o Loyd vai responder em inglês.
So we have 10 questions that were already summarized in our group, and Loyd will answer them in English, and afterwards we will propose the possibility of reading subtitled, okay, in Portuguese.
Após a explanação do Loyd, nós vamos fazer uma síntese das ideias que ele vai nos trazer no vídeo de hoje em português.
So after the video ends with Mr. Loyd, he's going to abandon us, and we will try to summarize every possible idea connected to us. So it's going to be in Portuguese, so you really can understand more what we shared with Mr. Loyd today.
Então, eu quero dar as boas-vindas ao Loyd. Estou muito feliz pela presença dele aqui no canal.
So welcome, Loyd, and we are very happy to receive you in this channel.
Thank you. Thank you. Good to see everybody.
Thank you, Loyd. E dizer que eu estudei com ele no Rhine Research Center, fiz 2 cursos sobre parapsicologia com ele lá, e estou muito feliz que ele possa aqui compartilhar o conhecimento dele.
Well, Daniel has been into 2 courses in the Rhine Institute with Mr. Loyd, and he cherished it a lot. So he's very glad that he's here to really show us some new information about parapsychology, okay?
Bom, agora eu passo a palavra para o Fábio, que vai ler as questões em inglês para o Loyd. Como ele já disse, vocês vão poder ativar as legendas em português, para quem não tem inglês fluente. E após a exposição dele, a gente vai fazer uma síntese de um debate em português. Então, eu passo a palavra agora para o Fábio, que vai dar sequência.
Well, I'm glad to be here. Thank you so much for this chance. And first of all, I will be very proud to present the curriculum of Mr. Loyd Auerbach, which is quite impressive. If you let me, world-recognized paranormal authority and parapsychologist Loyd Auerbach, MS, has 44 years of investigating the paranormal, over 40 years teaching courses in parapsychology, and thousands of media appearances. He's a director of the Office of Paranormal Investigations, president of the Forever Family Foundation, an adjunct professor at Atlantic University, and president of the board of directors of the Rhine Research Center, where he teaches online parapsychology courses through their education center. He's the co-author of 9 books on the paranormal for the general public, including ESP Wars, East and West, Psychic Dreaming, and the classic ESP, Hauntings and Poltergeists, a parapsychologist's handbook. He is also co-author of the paranormal mystery novels Near Death, A Rainy Day Investigation, and the second in the series Afterlife. He is a professional mentalist and past president of the Psychic Entertainers Association, performing as Professor Paranormal, and also does this thing as an occasional chocolatier, which is quite interesting, sir. So let's go with the first question. Here we go. How did you become interested in the parapsychology?
So my interest actually goes back to childhood, reading science fiction and comic books, and also certain television shows, especially in the 1960s. My father worked for NBC as a producer, And so I'm a child of the television world, had a TV set in my room when I was 2, and was first introduced to ideas of ghosts and psychics on television at a very, very young age. Reading science fiction, watching certain shows, sent me to the library to find books on psychic abilities. And I discovered that there were science books on parapsychology, which sent me down a path to somehow become involved in the field. I was very fortunate that there was a graduate school program with a master's degree program in parapsychology when I finished my undergraduate work in anthropology. And so that's kind of like the short story of how I got there. There's a lot of other twists and turns as well.
Well, very cool indeed. Now we are going for the second question. What is the scientific status of parapsychology, and why is it controversial?
Well, for the scientific status, I think it depends on who you speak with. The Parapsychological Association, which is the international organization of science and scientific parapsychologists, the organization has been a member of the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences since 1969, which makes it an officially recognized science, at least in the United States. It is recognized, although not always under the name parapsychology. In the United Kingdom, there are actually there's much more acceptance in Great Britain and other places around the world than the United States at this point. The problem we face in general is that unless folks look at our actual research and laboratory research is what really convinces people that science is going on, they think that we are making things up. They think that we are just simply working with fraudulent psychics, that we work with tarot card readers and other folks with no interest in science at all, or that our science is bad. Those who actually look at the research find, and we've seen this actually happen more recently, one of my colleagues convinced a number of other researchers in other fields, he's very good at convincing people, to look at our research, our experiments, and our controls. And a number of them were surprised to see that our controls, how we control the experiments in the lab, better than in most other sciences. We're much more careful, and to be honest, that's because we're a little paranoid. We have, because of the controversy, there is, and it's not as influential today as it was in the 1970s and 80s and 90s. There has been a skeptical movement, started partly as a result of the fame of Uri Geller in the 1970s. And that organization has kind of morphed and changed over the years. Their influence is not as great. Also, some of their major names have died, which is always a way that science changes when the old guard does pass away. But they have kind of caused a lot of difficulty for people in parapsychology, researchers over the years. And that is because many of them, and this is where we really run into things, whether it is from a materialist perspective or whether it is from a religious perspective. They say that either this phenomena, psychic phenomena, ESP, extrasensory perception, mind over matter, the idea of survival of bodily death, that spirits, all of this does not happen. They say, in fact, some of them will say it's completely impossible. And they will try to use things like other work in psychology, or even try to use physics to show that it is not possible. Most of the time, they're proven wrong in that sense. So there is basically at the heart of the controversy is the way Western science and some parts of Eastern science look at the world as a material thing with no opportunity for anything spiritual, or even the idea that consciousness is outside the brain or can reach outside the brain itself. So we are faced typically in the controversy with materialism being the root of most science, including psychology and other social sciences, at least here in the US and in North America in general. That prevents them from even considering an alternative, or even considering that the evidence shows something completely different. And to me, the biggest part of the problem is that they're not even willing to study people's experiences to look for an explanation that would fit what they believe. They just make assumptions. So, to many of us, that's not science.
Wow. Let's go for the third question.
Okay.
Could you give us some insight into dreams and extrasensory perception?
Yeah, the dream state is probably the most open to being psychic, to extrasensory perception in general, even to some extent to possibly contact with one's deceased relatives as well, which itself is extrasensory perception. It's a form of ESP. And the reason that is because when we are dreaming, the rules that we follow, the beliefs that we have about the way the world works they're completely gone. They don't exist the same way. Anything can happen in a dream, and it makes it easy for people who have information coming in that does prove to be true later on to simply say that's a coincidence, because they know that anything can happen in a dream. It's their imagination, it's their unconscious. The other thing is that because those rules are gone, the unconscious mind, which is what is receiving most ESP, most information that way, can actually integrate it and bring it in. The most common kinds of psychic dreams or dreams where ESP come in tend to be either precognitive, so picking up on information in the future, although many of those are not, how do I put this? They're very mundane. They're not very big. We hear about people dreaming about a disaster or something else. Sometimes it's somebody having a dream of finding a $5 bill when they leave their house the next day. So, in fact, that's a lot of those are kind of things that people have that happen all the time. The other common one is when you are connected to someone, a loved one, you may have a similar or same dream the same night with that person. So those are two fairly common things. That's often called mutual dreaming or telepathic dreaming. There's also the situations where people report going out of their body during the dream state. And while the out-of-body experience tends to happen when people are in the state between sleep and wakefulness, the hypnagogic state, what's interesting is people will report waking up and thinking about, explaining that they had a dream about visiting a friend of theirs, and they'll talk to that friend and find out that the friend had a dream about you coming and visiting me, or the friend will say, you were here. I saw you, like a ghost. So that person was able to connect in that way. So we have these kinds of experiences that come through. There are other dreams that might or might not be provide information that can be verified somehow or is extrasensory. For example, people have dreams about past lives, and we have no real way of confirming that at all. And then there are those visitation dreams, as I mentioned, where someone who you were connected to, a relative, a loved one, passes away, and they show up in your dream instead of like at the foot of your bed. But it's about us letting down our guard. The one thing we have learned above everything else in parapsychology, and this comes from the research in the laboratory, it comes from observations outside the laboratory, it comes from the people in the remote viewing programs as well, it comes from other psychics and other mediums, and that is we get in our own way. We second guess, we analyze information as we get it. So we either ignore it or it is only supplementary to what our normal senses pick up, which makes it not important. Or we say, well, that's not right. That there's another explanation for that as it happens. So we get in our own way. And for example, when the remote viewers in the US government program were trained to learn to do basic remote viewing, the first thing they had to do was learn that whatever comes through first, their first impressions, those must not be analyzed. Those must be recorded, stated out loud, drawn, written down, and then you can go back afterwards and see if you can fill in any blanks. And that always yields much better information. Maybe not complete information, but it steps aside from the idea that human beings are programmed to look for patterns, to find patterns when there are none. And it's all in our brains. It's all in our software in our brains, our wetware. And we're also seemingly programmed to name things, to categorize. So we have to learn to get out of our own way. And it's something that when I teach a course in developing ESP, and that's the first thing we have to work through, not just for remote viewing, but for anything to do with ESP, also for mediumship. People need to kind of get past that as well.
Well, amazing. Now we go for the fourth question. We know that you conduct field research involving alleged hauntings, apparitions, and poltergeists. How does your research work in general terms?
All right. Well, over the years, since the founding of the Society for Psychical Research in England in 1882, and there have been many organizations around the world that are close to 100 years old or over 100 years old, who have been looking at not only trying to do research experiments, but also looking at people's experiences outside the laboratory. And one category would be this idea of apparitions, hauntings, poltergeists, kind of bigger phenomena, more impactful phenomena than just a psychic dream, for example. So over that time, there have been distinctions made in what seems to be similar or grouped together experiences or phenomena. We've kind of separated them out a bit. So for example, an apparition is a term that's been used since the late 1800s, which is actually cleaner for us than ghost. The word ghost has so many different meanings or variations around the world that apparition, at least we can say, when people ask us, what does that mean? We can tell them. If I say ghost, people are going to make an assumption. They're going to assume something. So an apparition is consciousness without a body. For the most part, apparitions of the dead, consciousness is outside the body is deceased, the brain is deceased, consciousness still exists. People can experience or interact with that consciousness, and interaction is the main category, main factor for us. There are apparitions of the living. So for example, that person who goes out of body and is seen as a ghost by somebody else, that's an apparition of a living person. And there are a couple of other categories as well. The haunting is a term that is, there's other terms that have been used in parapsychology and psychical research, one of which is place memory, that places hold information about their past, just like objects hold information about their past, their owners and such. Hauntings, experiencing a haunting is similar to experiencing or trying psychometry, which is the ability to hold an object and get information about it. In a haunting, you're talking about a location. So instead of holding the object is holding you, and you're picking up information. So it's a form of ESP, picking up information that is somehow recorded in the environment. Hauntings typically are reported because people see a figure or they hear voices or footsteps, except that they can't record them. And the reason they can't record them is because it's not auditory, it's not visual. Same with apparitions. Apparitions are not optical phenomena. They don't reflect light. They don't give off light. So taking a picture of an apparition requires something completely different happening as well. Hauntings are very, very common. I like to say that, first of all, almost everyone who's ever gone house hunting or looking for an apartment has experienced walking into a place and saying, this place feels bad, or this place feels really good. That's because the people living there have left their emotional imprint. And we as human beings are capable of picking that up. If it's more extensive information, you may get a visual. You may get the sound of voices. You may get smells which don't really exist. You may even get sensations in those places. But it's living people leaving information in the environment. One of the things I have to deal with ghost hunters all the time, excuse me, is explaining to them that it doesn't have any, hauntings have nothing to do with the dead, any more than watching a movie made in 1930 has anything to do with dead people, except that most of those people are probably dead that were in the movie. When they made the movie, they were alive. We can keep watching that recording of that film forever, as long as that film exists. But that does not mean that we're seeing dead people. You know, we're seeing them when they were at their best, when they were alive. So when people see figures, they typically see the figures doing the same act over and over again. And a lot of folklore around the world suggests that those are ghosts who are trapped in a loop. They have to continue to do something. But we have situations like that very clearly where those loops that repeat over and over again are recordings of people who are still alive. So I had one of my cases in the 1990s for a television show was a couple that bought a house knowing that there had been a murder in the house. They got it very cheap. The husband was a police officer, so he didn't really think much of it. His wife was okay with it. They moved into the place. They actually had something else going on, which is why they called to begin with. That had nothing. It was more of a haunting kind of report, another haunting, but more of a pleasant one of the previous owners from before. But they had occasional times where they'd hear a woman scream at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, about 4 o'clock in the living room. And then they had a couple of relatives who came over, and if they were sitting on the couch, where in a couple of instances one of them was napping, and he got woken up by a scream, and he saw a man standing over a woman and stabbing her. And when clearly the woman had died, the recording or what he saw was gone. The problem here, they thought they had the ghost of a killer in the house, except the husband knew that that was not the case because the killer was in jail. He was alive. He was not repeating his actions. He was not having an out-of-body experience. And what they knew they were seeing was, or experiencing was, a recording of a past event, an emotional event. It tend to be fairly emotional. So for hauntings, we try to figure out, first of all, if what they're seeing, who they're seeing is interactive, will react to them. That makes it an apparition. Or we're looking at a recording of past events. Sometimes we can prove them out. We can research and find that they actually happened, sometimes not. One of the most famous hauntings here in the United States is the Gettysburg battlefield from our Civil War. And people have reported seeing soldiers and hearing gunshots and all of that. But years ago, I spoke with 3 different actors who were taking part in a mini-series for television about the Gettysburg battle. And these were all people, there were a group of people, like actually hundreds of them, who were what we call Civil War reenactors. They dress up and reenact the battles and things. And they were camping out. They were given permission to camp on the battlefield, which was completely unusual. And they would wake up in the middle of the night to use the porta potty, the restroom, and they would see soldiers walking through their tents as if the living people aren't there. And several of them got a little scared, but then it didn't take much to realize that they were seeing the same thing over and over again. And then they got excited because they realized they were seeing part of the actual battle that they were reenacting. They were seeing a recording. That was much more interesting to them than if there had been ghosts there, unless the ghost had spoken to them. So it's highly emotionally charged situations, and we think that there's a connection to the Earth's magnetic field in certain spots as well for that. Poltergeist phenomena, it comes up in a lot of different ways in different parts of the world, but the term poltergeist, which means noisy ghosts, goes back to the 16th century in Germany, at least, and refers to situations where there's purely physical phenomena. It's incredibly rare for anyone in a case where there's physical things happening, things flying around, things breaking. These days, we have a lot of issues with electronics that happen in poltergeist cases as well. And there's almost never a ghost seen or heard. There's no sense of presence. And I have taken, and as have my colleague, taken really good psychics and mediums into poltergeist cases. And they very clearly say there are no spirits present because they're not sensing any. one of them, who I worked with for many years, was able to determine who among the living was responsible. Because what we found is that there's typically a living person we call the poltergeist agent who is unconsciously reacting to either stress or something neurological. There's about 30% of the cases that connect to epilepsy or temporal lobe activity, temporal epileptiform activity. So it's almost like for them, the physical stuff is the seizure that's happening. One of my colleagues who did a lot of research on that said that during the time the physical activity was happening outside of them, they did not have a seizure at all. And some of them were able to take themselves off medication for that entire time. So that was a pretty interesting thing. The other side of it is the 70% stress. A large percentage of them are adolescents from age 11 or 12 to about early 20s. There is a stereotype of teenage girls being responsible all the time. And that stereotype actually, at least in our part of the world, was created not on purpose, but by Stephen King and the book Carrie and his movie, and the first version of the movie Carrie. Movies have a huge influence. You know, pop culture has a big influence on people. After the movie The Exorcist came out, most people threw away their Ouija boards because they were afraid of them. So it's a sad thing, but it is true. We see that also in our politics today here in the States. Poltergeist phenomena is really interesting because in some respects, it's the easiest for us to figure out, like who's doing it. It's a detective game. Who's there all the time? Who has the motivation? Who's undergoing stress? All of those things. And because of that, once we identify the agent, we can usually get it to stop pretty easily too by working with them. So it's a little different. But the thing is, for the average person, all of this looks like it's the same. We just have to really dive in, ask a lot of questions, observe the environment. Sometimes I bring in psychics and mediums. I have several that I work with over the years because I want their extra insight in addition to the witness insight that's there.
Well, wow. The fifth question would be, could you give us examples of these investigations? But I think you already gave us some examples, especially the Ouija board relating to the Exorcist movie and Carrie as well. But maybe if you could give another poltergeist example,
Sure.
which is quite interesting, just to complement, the fifth question, it would be okay.
Yeah, I can give you a good example of an unusual poltergeist. I mean, it's something that doesn't happen as often. We had a case here outside of San Francisco where the family was reporting they were having bursts of water right below the ceiling that would splatter in all directions. They'd hear a pop and they'd see kind of like water going everywhere. And this went on for a few weeks before the husband, who was very, very logical, he accepted there wasn't a normal explanation, so he looked for some unusual explanations. He wanted to know if there were pipes in the ceiling that could have maybe been causing this. He wanted to know if it was weird, if it was unusual condensation because of air quality or weather or something like that. He brought in someone from our local utilities company to look for any other alternatives for that. Brought in plumbers, all sorts of people. No explanation for it. In fact, he had tried to figure out what was going on. He actually even thought maybe one of his two kids was somehow throwing water balloons or throwing water at the ceiling. So he and his wife were on high alert to watch what was going on. One of the best examples of how he knew it absolutely wasn't his son David, who was the one who was always around, was when the man from the utilities company came and was stumped after hearing all that. He was very interested, very stumped. And so Don, the husband, basically sent the son, David, down the hallway. They could see from the living room directly into the kitchen. They could see the faucet on the sink. And a lot of times David either was near a source of water or he had a glass of water in his hands. But the popping water bursts happened far away from him. So he was not throwing this. So they wanted to keep an eye on David's younger brother. David was 12 at the time. They wanted to see if his younger brother was doing it too. So they had him with the man from the utilities company, with the two of them, watching David walk over to us to the sink way down the hall. And when David turned on the water and then turned it off, there were 5 successive pops of water, one of which happened almost above them, one right after the other. So this was something that the utilities man then said to Don. He said, "You need a different kind of expert." And that's how we got contacted, actually. The family was at their next door neighbors when I got the call, and the neighbor knew about JFK University, the university's parapsychology program at the time. And so I'm speaking to the father, and all of a sudden in the background, I hear another male voice saying, "Don, it's happening here." And I hear some popping sounds. And apparently while the family was over at the next door neighbors, the water bursts were happening there too. So I had them put the son on the phone with me, and part of our process is always interviewing. I mean, that's a major piece of the process of doing an investigation. And in this case, we already knew who the common factor was, who the likely poltergeist agent was. So I asked him a very simple question, this 12-year-old boy. "What's stressing you out? What's happened?" And he was very honest. He hated the fact that they thought he was doing it because he wasn't doing it consciously. He knew that. And he said, "Well, I used to be in martial arts classes, and that was a lot of fun for me. And then the martial arts teacher started having us compete against other schools. And I didn't want to compete. I just wanted to learn martial arts. So I quit. And then my parents, because they wanted me to have some after school, activities, pushed me to the swim team because they knew I liked to swim, but I didn't want to compete." And I said, "Well, did you tell your parents you didn't want to be on a team?" He said, "No, I don't want to talk to them about that." I said, "Well, that's what's going on." So I got back on the phone with the father. I explained, if you think about this, he was on the swim team. He was forced to be on the swim team, which is when the water burst happened. This is about as obvious as you can get. We never got a chance to get a sample of the water to see if it was pool water. I would have liked to have known if it was somehow coming from, teleported from a swimming pool. But they, I got on the phone with the mother. I went out to see them. We talked about this. I got him into a martial arts class. I knew a kung fu teacher who did not have his students compete unless they really wanted to. He focused more on the history of martial arts, the philosophy of kung fu, moving chi around your body, dealing with stress and all of that. Phenomena stopped. It pretty much dialed down or went down after they were allowed him to leave the swim team. So it's one of those things that once you know, number one, who the person is, and then what's going on in their life, if it's stress related, and can work out a way to either divert the stress. So he was able to kind of divert his physical stress somewhere else, which is back to martial arts. That tends to stop things, but counseling sometimes is needed because the stressor can be trauma too. I've had a couple of cases where it was grief of a child losing, a teenager losing parents that caused activity, the stress. They were now stuck with their grandparents. They didn't want to be there. So there can be other things that require kind of longer term counseling as well.
Wow. Sixth question. It's a double one. How to trust the quality of a medium, and how do you know if their analysis is reliable?
All right, say that first part again.
How to trust the quality of a medium.
How to trust the quality of a medium. Yeah.
And how do you know if their analysis is reliable is the second part.
Well, how do you know that anybody's information is reliable about anything? I mean, how do you know my information is reliable? You have to, there are a couple of things I do when I'm working with mediums. First of all, I'm very fortunate over the years to have worked with people who were already well established. And I usually have them, do a reading for me, or I take them on a case that I know some information about where they couldn't have read about it, for example, that kind of thing. I want to see what they can add to those cases. So for newer people, I will often have them go to a place that it's not a family setting. I don't want to test someone in a family setting typically, because besides reliability or accuracy or information that's useful, to me, in some respects, it doesn't matter if the psychic or medium actually a psychic or a medium, if they are coming up with accurate observations or useful information that helps us with those investigations. So, for example, the psychic and medium I worked with for many years until she passed away in 2011, her family business, her grandfather had started several hardware stores. And she was very grounded. She was managing them when growing up. She and her husband did some stuff online. They had one of the first online stores before Amazon did, selling CDs. So she had a normal background besides being a really good psychic and medium. And so she would make observations sometimes of normal things that were explaining what people were reporting, because she knew all that stuff. So she was useful even if she wasn't being a medium at that point. I also look to see whether or not there's a certain personality that I like to work with, or that we like to work with in the field. There are some psychics and mediums out there who are very, very good psychically, because of being a medium is still being psychic, but they are not people you want to work with. I've observed some other groups, some amateur ghost hunting groups who have a so-called sensitive or member of their group who claims to be psychic, and I couldn't tell that they were being psychic at all in what I saw. But what I did see sometimes is if the attention of the group or certain members of the group wasn't sticking with them, they would start making noise. They'd say, "Oh, I'm getting something." They'd want to be the center of attention. So for those of us who are really trying to do the work here, we don't like to work with mediums who are not team players or psychics. They have to be willing to be questioned. So I will sometimes ask if the impression the person got, if that's really what they were getting, or if there was some other first impression. They get in their own way sometimes too. We look for practitioners who are also good with people. Most mediums, I have to say that the Forever Family Foundation, which I'm president of, does scientific testing of mediums to make sure that their accuracy rate is really good. We also have interviews with them for personality issues too. And I find that most mediums are very good with people, living or dead. I don't find that with all psychics. Some psychics can get really good information. I've known some remote viewers, for example, are really good at remote viewing, but they're terrible in social skills. They're not very good with that. So we want people for investigations who are very good socially. They work with people well. They work with the other investigators well. They're willing to be questioned, to kind of dig deeper, and even point it out if they're wrong, because sometimes they will pick up information that still might be psychic that has nothing to do with the case. So we have to kind of look at that as well. And then the idea of them being in the spotlight is really, that's a deal breaker for us, for me, certainly. I've seen, we have a lot of psychics and mediums who've been on TV over the years, and there used to be one who pretty much was, as far as I was concerned, was a fraud. But she was able to convince a lot of people she was genuine. And she, after she and her husband got arrested for her and her husband trying to basically take some money from clients, she psychically apparently picked up an old gold mine and said that there's a place in the gold mine that, this is here in the San Francisco area, that will pay off. So we're going to buy the gold mine and you need to invest. Well, that was a complete scam. Her husband went to jail for a few years. She got probation for 3 years. And somehow after that probation, after she came back to the San Francisco Bay Area, I believe she did a reading for a couple of celebrities who thought she was good. And one of them connected her to a talk show host. And from what, we can't prove this right now, but there was people in the TV industry who I know who said that that psychic invested money in the show itself so that she was a weekly guest on the show. The problem, and this is something that I kind of, regardless of whether she was psychic or not, she was mean to people on the show and in person. She was very, very, very dismissive of people, very mean. If somebody said, and I have a couple of examples of this, somebody said, our house is haunted. We have a ghost. It's a male ghost. She would go in and she would say, no, you're wrong. It's a female ghost. And she had a good story behind that. She always disagreed with the witnesses, who were the ones who were bringing her in to begin with, which is kind of amusing in some respects. So I have a good background. As you mentioned before, I'm a mentalist, psychic entertainer. I have a background in magic and I perform. I have some good people I can tap for issues of potential psychic fraud as well. And so I'm pretty good at determining a number of things about the psychics and mediums, depending on what's going on with their readings. And I've seen good ones and I've seen people who are genuinely psychic, but you know, they don't provide a lot of, they pick up good stuff that is, they could not have known, but it's not terribly useful.
Cool. Seventh question. What is your personal opinion after 40 years of research into the survival of human consciousness after death, after we go away?
Sure. I believe, well, I'm not a materialist, so that's number one. I think I started out as one for sure. But I'd say that the evidence shows that there really is a form of consciousness that exists after death. I could not comment specifically on about what the afterlife is like, you know, other than to say that it's probably more different than we can imagine because you're a person without a body up there, wherever that is. But I do, from the 140 plus years of evidence of cases, especially ones that have been really looked at and kind of ripped apart, put back together, my own experiences. I had one case years ago where the only possibilities for the quality and amount of information a 12-year-old boy was coming up with in communication, he was seeing a ghost every day. His parents had seen the ghost as well. His grandmother had seen the ghost. None of them spoke to each other about it until this boy spoke up one day to his mother. Friendly ghosts. I mean, they were kind of ignoring the ghost. He was talking to her every day. The amount of information he came up with, which I got verified by the woman's only living relative, a 92-year-old man in an assisted living facility. He confirmed family stories that this ghost had told the boy. And there was the only other possibilities are there was that the kid had found and memorized dozens of diaries from throughout this woman's life that did not exist. I mean, the mother was a very smart and wise attorney. They bought this house. They did buy a lot of old antique furniture it was an estate sale because the woman had died and the only relative was in an assisted living facility. But there was absolutely no paperwork. There was no books, no diaries, none of that was there. And what his mother said was, he's smart, but he's not that smart. And the other possibility was that the boy himself was incredibly psychic and just picking up the family stories from the recordings in the walls, so to speak. But there was additional things that happened as part of our interview process that indicated that he really was speaking with someone. So that case alone is the one that kind of made me go from, well, maybe there are apparitions and maybe not, to, yeah, there definitely are apparitions. So I firmly believe in consciousness surviving the death of the body and consciousness being more than us, or just our brains.
Oh, eighth question. How to differentiate the fantasy construction of children's psyches or even symptoms resulting from mental disorders and facts, also data, from shared reality for an investigation in parapsychology? It's a long one.
Okay, well, yeah. Little children, especially, because we've had cases with small children as well. That's a lot more difficult. You have to be careful about how you interview them. Besides from a legal perspective, you don't want to be alone with the kids,
Mhm.
especially these days. Children, we know, look towards parents for, acknowledgement, and we know that they're going to agree with their parents quite a bit. So we have to be careful about asking questions and getting more detail if possible. And frankly, I've had cases where I had some older kids who separately told me that they didn't have the experiences their parents said they witnessed, but they had a different experience which they never told their parents. So and they all fit together. But the older kids will say, my little brother is going to agree with whatever my parents said. He didn't really see anything. So there's that element, which is not, mental illness, but it's not exactly fantasy. It's really maybe the fantasy of the parents, but it's going along with things. We see husbands and wives doing that too. The other thing, though, with little kids, is that the ones who have had real experiences often have incredible detail, which go beyond what you'd expect for an invisible friend or something else. So they have more detail. And then it's typically not just the child who is having that experience. So I've had a couple of cases which involved actually infants or toddlers, so children that were 2 years old. And in one of them, the mother was very concerned because they had seen the apparition of this man. And then they saw the little girl talking about just basically acting like this. She would say, "Bad man hurt me, held me, grabbed me." So they were very concerned about the little girl. And it turned out, after working through the case, that it was not what was going on. The apparition we actually used hypnosis on one of the witnesses. And under hypnosis, she was the best witness. She was the one who saw this apparition the most. We had her act as the medium. And we got information that we could confirm later on about someone who died 4 blocks away in the town. We were able to identify him. He, through the witness under hypnosis, said he really liked kids, and he was apologizing. Was trying to lift up the little girl because he really liked kids. That's what was going on. He had died of a heart attack. He was wandering the neighborhood. Finally, these people could see him. And actually, after that, everything was fine. The family was okay with him even being around, although we kind of helped him move on at that point. I had another case where, again, it was a toddler who would laugh, giggle, and start babbling to someone who wasn't there. The thing is that occasionally the parents would see that someone, and it was a young woman who was kind of entertaining the girl. So we have to look for, with very small children, there's not much we can do. With other children, we have to look for detail or confirmation that what's going on there. Frankly, if we have a case where only one person in an entire family is seeing something, we have to consider psychological issues, whether they're a child or adult. Or, and the issue may be they're trying to get attention. I even had a case where a teenage boy was actually faking poltergeist activity to get back at his parents for something, because they were interested in poltergeist phenomena. So he kind of made a poltergeist. So we have to look for all those things too. I brought in child psychologists from time to time. And, there's differing opinions about a child who has an invisible friend, whether that's a good thing or not. So I think it really depends.
Oh. The ninth question. Have you ever carried out studies with native people on inducing altered states of consciousness?
I have not. The only time I've worked with indigenous people at all, and it was really for a short time, was with, excuse me, I was an Australian Aborigine. So I was working with a Japanese medium, and we were doing a TV special, which we did a series of specials, one of which took us to Australia, to the northern end of Australia, what's called the top end. There's a huge Aboriginal preserve called Kakadu National Park in Arnhem Land. And Arnhem Land is a very large territory. We visited the Aboriginal capital there. You know, they're not as nomadic. They've been forced by people to settle down, although there are still nomadic Aborigines in Australia. And we worked with an Aboriginal artist who was the traditional guardian of one of their spiritual monoliths, one of the rock monoliths. So I spent a bit of time talking to him, and then we did some experiments at the sacred site with the artist and the psychic, the medium from Japan, which were really, really interesting, especially in his reaction to her abilities. The Australian Aborigines integrate psychic experience in their lives. It's normal for them. And there's a lot of reports from anthropologists. It's really interesting that my background is in cultural anthropology in college. And I got fascinated by the Aborigines because in some anthropology texts or reports of Aboriginal beliefs and their work, the anthropologists reported seeing something going on, didn't want to say, oh, it's psychic, but they described psychic phenomena that they witnessed. One of them actually has a small section in his book called Aboriginal telepathy. So I got fascinated by all that. There was a study by an anthropologist in conjunction with the Rhine Center, actually the Duke Parapsychology Lab, back in the 50s, where he tested Aborigines, also very, very psychic. So the most interesting thing for me was not as interesting for the Japanese folks, probably not what they were looking for. But after we had these connections between the medium, the Japanese medium, and the Aboriginal artist, they asked, or had me ask the Aboriginal artist, how did she do? Because part of this was testing her with the Aboriginal. And he kind of looked very serious and said, okay. And for Japanese television, that's not exciting. You know, Japanese television is kind of over the top. So I finally said to him, so compared to kids, Aboriginal kids in Oenpelli, how'd she do? Oh, the kids do much better, and we all do much better than that. But for someone who's not with us, she did really well. So still, she was fine. She didn't have a big ego, so she was okay with that. I have a colleague who spent a lot of time on the Navajo reservation working with Navajo beliefs in the paranormal and that as well. And there are others in the field who have actually done that kind of work with indigenous people too. I haven't had a lot of opportunity.
Oh, okay. So here we go for the 10th question. What is your opinion about the connection between the contents of the unconscious, anomalous phenomena, and access to other dimensions?
Well, we know that ESP, the information we get, even mediums get it, it's filtered through the unconscious. It doesn't come directly into the conscious mind, it seems, partly, again, because we get in our own way. And so it takes effort to learn how to not get in your way. The unconscious provides information. One of my colleagues has pointed out that however the physics of ESP works, there's a psychological piece that is, the information can come in very accurately, perhaps. We have no idea if that's the case, where it just comes through a little bit at a time. And then it needs to bubble up to our conscious minds. And that's the unconscious kind of filtering for things. But the connection to other dimensions, it partly depends on what you mean by other dimensions. I, as a science fiction and comic book fan, there's a lot of writing in fiction about other dimensions. And of course, we see a lot of stuff now in movies and other things about the multiverse, parallel universes. And there was a researcher, philosopher named J.W. Dunn back in the 1930s and 40s and 50s. He did studies of psychic dreaming. In fact, he wrote a book about his own psychic dreams. He wrote a book called The Serial Universe. Not parallel, but serial, like one next to the other. And he did a lot. I've got a copy of the book. It's really interesting. He was theorizing. It was based on some quantum ideas, the many worlds theory. He was theorizing how very often if there are other parallel universes, they don't line up exactly. He also pointed out that time itself may not be anything more than, may not be truly linear. may be in parallel or serial. So there's a lot of controversy around the idea of what time itself actually is, and if it's a thing, or whether we just make it up. So Dunn actually talked about these other universes. He did mention dimension, but he wasn't really talking about the dimensions we think about, like 3 dimensions, 4 dimensions, or what physicists talk about. So if there's another plane of existence, that's what a lot of psychics like to use. Many psychics and mediums talk about vibration rate, the frequency of energy. We have a pretty good idea from physics about frequency and about energy, and it's something else. I mean, it either has to be another form, just like with psiability, it has to be a different form of energy. It's working very differently than what our physics can currently explain. I think that there probably are other worlds that we're kind of in the same space, but maybe vibrating differently. That may be the case. That is an idea right out of science fiction, and actually from Dunn himself. There's a lot of space between atoms. I think the way it's explained in certain comic books, and coming from Dunn and others, is that there's a lot of space between atoms, and the atoms vibrate. Atoms of our body vibrate. And if things are vibrating in those spaces in between, we're not going to know that they're there. We're not going to be able to perceive them. We're not going to be able to have any physical contact with them, as long as they never collide, so to speak. And that's, from a physics perspective, possible. The question is, what is information? How are we getting information from these other places as well? And that's really the big question. A lot of mediums talk about communicating with spirit, because spirits vibrate at a higher frequency. And they talk about raising their vibration. And, if you're going to raise your vibration to match that of a spirit, you wouldn't have a physical body at that point. You'd kind of be gone. So there's a lot of language issues we have with these things. There's also the idea in physics that the smallest, if you go down below the quantum level, you're going to find that the universe itself is made up of just information. So there's a lot of different ways to approach this when you talk about other dimensions. For the most part, the apparitions that we're dealing with have not left this physical world. There are not that many of them comparatively to people who've died. Mediums tend to communicate with folks who have passed on to this transition to whatever the next state of existence is. So there's 2 different types of these spirits that we're dealing with. Some that are more connected to us physically, and others that are in that other dimension, other world, whatever it actually is. But even the mediums are getting information filtered from those spirits in the afterlife. It is filtering through their unconscious, so that when they have a conversation about what it's like, and most mediums get asked at some point, what is the afterlife like? And it comes across as for most mediums and across the board, going back, at least in spiritualism as opposed to spiritism, it definitely comes across as a nice, pleasant thing, that you can have a house, you can have family, you see everybody that's there. To my mind, that makes little sense. That means we haven't truly changed when we transition. So to my mind, and several others, and even the mediums have said this, that they can only explain things in terms that the mediums themselves understand. So if they were shown something that makes no sense, given what the medium actually knows, they can only label it with terms we understand. Hence a house, a nice pleasant area, all of that. So when I said at the very beginning, it's probably more different than we can imagine, I meant that. Hope that answered the question.
Well, I think so. Mr. Roisman, now the word is with you.
Very nice, Loyd. Very interesting. Thank you very much for your explanation. Do you have any last commentary or reflection that you want to share with us?
Well, I will say that Brazil has quite a bit going on in parapsychology. There's a few centers that actually, a couple of universities are doing work. There's a neuroscience center in Rio that's doing some work right now. They're kind of like quietly doing work in parapsychology, but they're not saying that they are. I know that they're going to be doing some work with some physical mediums and some other mediums as well. So there's quite a bit going on there, and fortunately, our colleagues in Brazil do tell us what's going on, and vice versa. They come to our events and such. But one of the things I want to say is looking cross-culturally, there are different perspectives on how what's behind the experience, and even how research is done. I worked with a couple of Chinese researchers a few years ago, and one of them was very suspicious of his lab partner in the phenomena that was being looked at, because he was both someone, he had grown up in mainland China, he was a faculty member there at a university, but his son had moved to the United States, so he's exposed quite a bit to Western stuff as well. And so he's in conflict in the way that they were looking at the abilities in China versus here in the States, and even how they could even talk about them. Apparently in China, although I think it's chi, they could not actually use ESP or psychic or any of those words to describe what was going on at all. So I would say that a cross-cultural look as best you can, if you really want to see how people look at these things. I mean, certainly I've done that with ghosts, with apparitions over the years, and hauntings. That's helpful. It's really helpful to do that. And knowing that, maybe we're all wrong. I have to say that, and I've said this to many of the skeptics I've met, the disbelievers. Okay, you think we're doing the wrong thing? Fine. We're the only ones looking at these experiences. If you're not going to look at them and you don't agree with our interpretation, then there's something wrong with you, not with us.
Very nice, Loyd. I totally agree with you. It's an open mind question. Yes, very nice.
Yeah, you don't find the answers unless everybody asks the questions.
Exactly. Yes. So, can we finish now?
Sure, unless anybody has another question.
Alguém tem mais alguma pergunta? Algum comentário para fazer com o Loyd? Anybody? More questions? No? It's okay?
Okay.
So
I will leave you now to your translation.
yes.
All right.
Agora a gente vai interromper o vídeo e vai dar seguimento a uma conversa entre nós em português. Você quer falar inglês isso, Fábio?
Well, now you finished the video. It was really amazing, always some time. Thank you so much. And we're going into Portuguese lands right now.
Okay, well,
to share all the information you have gave us. And we are tremendously happy and thankful for this. Thank you so much.
You're very
welcome. It was
welcome.
a pleasure meeting you. A really
Nice
pleasure
to meet you all
you.
as well.
Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much.
Nice, Loyd. Bye. Bom, então agora estamos retomando aqui, né, o encontro. A gente vai poder fazer algumas associações em torno da fala do Loyd, né? É uma fala complexa, né? Que para entendimento precisa realmente de um inglês avançado. A gente sabe que mesmo nas legendas também se perdem coisas, né? Porque a legenda é gerada automaticamente. Mas digamos assim que eu também vou procurar levantar algumas questões sobre o estudo da parapsicologia que eu tenho feito ultimamente. Eu sou membro do Ryan Research Center, né? Que o Loyd pertence. Estou fazendo cursos lá. Também sou membro da Parapsychological Association, que fica nos Estados Unidos. Ambas são norte-americanas, né? Instituições muito sérias, que já existem há várias décadas, né? Com estudo empírico no campo da parapsicologia, né? A parapsicologia, ela originalmente surge como os 4 grandes, né? Que é clarividência, telepatia, pré-cognição, né? E telecinese. E depois ela foi, ao longo dos anos, se ampliando para outros campos, né, de interesse, como, por exemplo, a mediunidade, experiências de quase morte, os poltergeists, né, as aparições, as assombrações, né? Mas do ponto de vista do laboratório, são essas 4 primeiras, né? A pré-cognição, a telecinese, a telepatia e a clarividência ou visão remota, né, que ele falou, né? A psicocinese seria a capacidade de movimentar objetos ou produzir efeitos na matéria, melhor dizendo, não só movimentar objetos, né, mas interagir com objetos através de poderes mentais, né? Essa seria a telecinese ou psicocinese, né, são sinônimos. A clarividência ou visão remota seria a possibilidade de enxergar lugares sem os 5 sentidos habituais. Inclusive, podem ser lugares no presente, por exemplo, programas dos Estados Unidos, da Rússia, de enxergar bases inimigas, né? Com o poder da mente, ver o que tem lá, né? Enfim, tem toda uma polêmica sobre o uso de paranormais aí em programas avançados, né? Dos Estados Unidos, né? Da Rússia, na Guerra Fria, para poder visualizar aí ameaças. Isso é um programa de visão remota ou clarividência, né? Você tem também a telepatia, né, que seria a comunicação de pensamento entre pessoas, né, que pode ser espontânea ou não, e que os sonhos, né, dentro desses estudos, muitas vezes são janelas para essa conexão telepática, né? Então, já falei, e a pré-cognição, que seria, digamos, a possibilidade de conhecer conhecimentos vindouros, né? Tem um pensamento que antecipa algo que ainda não aconteceu, né? E a partir disso, enfim, vai havendo uma atualização, né? Experiências de quase morte, mediunidade, né? Os fenômenos de poltergeist, né? Que seriam luzes que acendem sozinhas e apagam. No relato da Sônia, nós tivemos aqui, né? As televisões que ligavam sozinhas no último volume, copos que explodiam do nada sozinhos. Então, isso, digamos, pode ser entendido na parapsicologia como fenômenos do tipo poltergeist, né? Que seriam efeitos da mente sobre a matéria. Aí pode ser a mente, dentro desses estudos, de um morto, né? Que aí o Loyd falou a mente como sobrevivendo à morte física de alguém, sendo de uma entidade ou de um falecido, ou a mente de um vivo, né? No fim, a mente ela não estaria reduzida ao cérebro, por isso a parapsicologia ela entra num terreno extremamente controverso, porque se você for um materialista convicto, você vai dizer que a parapsicologia é uma pseudociência e tal, que ela não que ela carece de fundamento, que ela é um equívoco em si mesmo, né? Então, do mesmo jeito que a psicanálise tem sofrido ataques desde sempre, a parapsicologia também sempre foi um campo bastante controverso, mesmo existindo centros sérios na Europa, nos Estados Unidos, tanto dentro como fora de universidades de estudos no campo da parapsicologia, né? Atualmente no Brasil nós temos, inclusive na Universidade de São Paulo, a possibilidade de estudos, mas não só lá, no campo da psicologia anomalística, que é uma atualização da parapsicologia. Como parapsicologia ficou um termo muito estigmatizado, né, assim, do paranormal, né? Se você fala esse termo, muita gente já sai correndo, já olha meio torto para você. Então, eles atualizaram em alguns lugares esse termo como psicologia anomalística, né? Que, inclusive, nós temos vários vídeos aqui no canal até com o Fábio Eduardo da Silva, né, que fez o doutorado dele lá na USP, nessa área, com o professor Wellington Zangari, né, que é bastante conhecido, ele era da PUC, depois foi para a USP, da PUC de São Paulo, né? E a psicologia anomalística lida com os chamados fenômenos anômalos, né? Anômalos no sentido daquilo que escapa ao paradigma científico estabelecido segundo Thomas Kuhn, na sua obra sobre a estrutura das revoluções científicas, né? Então, é um anômalo no sentido que está numa borda, numa zona limite do conhecimento científico estabelecido, ou seja, nós não temos referências epistemológicas suficientes para compreender a natureza desses fenômenos. Então, tanto o inconsciente, a gente está numa zona limite com a ciência materialista, o próprio Loyd, eu ia dizer o Freud, né? Mas o próprio Loyd falou, né, de que as mensagens, o contato com outros mundos, eles vêm por uma via fundamentalmente inconsciente, né? Então, é um mundo muito interessante. O Loyd é uma pessoa de grande respeito, já tem mais de 40 anos de experiência aí na área, tem casos, ele vai a campo, apareceu em vários programas de televisão nos Estados Unidos, e é uma pessoa muito séria, por isso que a gente trouxe ele aqui no canal, e ele também tem críticas a um uso, digamos assim, comercial da parapsicologia, por pessoas que estão ali vendendo um peixe e tal, ou num sensacionalismo televisivo através de reality shows, que ele também é um crítico, né? Então, até já falaram para ele, mas quem você é para falar de parapsicologia? Nenhum show de TV você tem, né? Quer dizer, como se a pessoa tivesse que ter um show, né? Ou ser um caça-fantasma lá no filme para poder ser famoso. Não, ele realmente ele é um cara que leva tudo isso de uma forma bastante rigorosa, tanto é que ele é um como é que é?
Prestidigitador.
Prestidigitador, ele é um ilusionista, então ele conhece bem as práticas de ilusionismo, de modo que ele tem ferramentas para fazer um diagnóstico diferencial do que é alguém pregando uma peça, do que são eventualmente fantasias ou erros de leitura e do que seriam efetivamente fenômenos anômalos que fogem do paradigma estabelecido. Então, a gente precisa considerar que aí é diferente da psicanálise, onde a gente aceita as narrativas sem um diagnóstico diferencial, né, sem um pré-julgamento. No caso da parapsicologia e da psicologia anomalítica, eles precisam fazer essa diferenciação para ver o que é uma invenção deliberada, uma fraude, o que é um erro de interpretação e o que, descartando essas duas possibilidades, apontaria para um legítimo fenômeno paranormal, embora eles mesmos digam que, no fundo, paranormal é um nome que se dá ao que é normal, mas aquilo que a gente não consegue explicar, então a gente chama de paranormal. Mas, no fundo, o paranormal ele é uma normalidade a qual nós não compreendemos ainda, né? Então, por isso que está dentro de um espírito científico nesse sentido. Mas, enfim, eu fiz essa breve introdução para localizar vocês, lembrando que o Freud e o Jung, eles eram correspondentes da Sociedade de Pesquisas Psíquicas, que foi a primeira grande associação de parapsicologia no mundo, data do século XIX. O Freud tem textos sobre sonhos e telepatia, né, onde ele chega a eventualmente cogitar que isso seria possível, sem de fato dizer que sim. E depois ele se desliga dessa sociedade, o Freud, né, como um correspondente, mas o Jung sim permanece como correspondente. Então, quer dizer, a obra do Jung tem uma série de elementos que nos apontam para uma intimidade maior com a parapsicologia. Mais recentemente, graças ao professor Everton Maraldi, aqui do Laboratório Númina, da Pontifícia Universidade Católica de São Paulo, eu tive contato com autores franceses psicanalíticos que trabalham com experiências anômalas. Então, não é necessário ser um junguiano para contemplar parapsicologia e experiências anômalas. É possível, sim, falar disso dentro da psicanálise. Um deles é o Renaud Evrard, né? Que é um psicanalista francês e é parapsicólogo também, tá? Então, nada disso é o que a gente está inventando, já é um campo de trabalho sério e vasto, e já existem pessoas no mundo articulando essas áreas do saber. Tá? Mas, enfim, falei já bastante, né? Quero passar aí a palavra a vocês, vamos produzir associações aí em torno da fala do Loyd e além, né?
Ele trouxe algumas coisas muito interessantes relacionadas a exemplos, que sempre dão uma cor, né, para a palestra, para essa aula linda que ele deu. E um dos exemplos que ele acabou se aprofundando um pouco mais é no poltergeist, do rapazinho que queria fazer Kung Fu, não pôde e foi obrigado a ir para natação. E aí a materialização que acontecia depois de muita espionagem no garoto, né, para ver se era ele que estava jogando água no teto, eram essas explosões de água no teto, que era muito interessante, acho que para cair em cima dos pais. Eu imaginei eu, né, que eram os que puniram ele, falaram, não, você vai fazer natação. Logo depois eles descobriram que era na entrevista que ele faz, né, porque uma das técnicas dele não é acusar, é entrevistar, né, e ele chega para a criança e começa a entrevistar o rapazinho e acaba descobrindo, né, via a elaboração do rapazinho, o que estava acontecendo com essa escolha de querer fazer Kung Fu e não poder fazer Kung Fu, e no final a história termina bem, ele vai fazer o Kung Fu, acredito que a tal da água parou de pingar. O interessante é que ele queria, né? Ele falou, pena que não deu para a gente pegar uma amostra da água para descobrir se não é uma materialização da água da piscina vindo sobre os pais. Né? E isso é interessante, porque se a água fosse clorada ou salgada, né, dependendo do tipo de estrutura da piscina, da escola, ele ia ter uma certeza de que havia uma materialização potente de poltergeist do garoto sobre os pais. Achei isso incrível. E aí ele também falou de uma coisa bacana, que sobre a época da Carrie a Estranha, né, de muitas moças estarem elaborando poltergeists, né, porque histericamente elas estariam associando o filme a uma sintomatologia. É potente isso, porque aí eu que pensei, né, me traz aquelas histéricas do Charcot e do Breuer, né, que tem a ver com a cultura e como o inconsciente é plástico e muda com o tempo. Então, as histéricas de agora estariam mais, ou histéricos, tanto faz, né, estariam mais conectadas com a Carrie a Estranha, quando viram o filme, e ficaram afetadas pelos eventos poltergeist que acontecem com a Carrie a Estranha, que, aliás, é um filme sensacional e um livro incrível também, né? Acho que quando ele quantifica os exemplos é maravilhoso, ou quando ele vai para sonhos. Adorei aquela história do casal sonhar a mesma coisa, achei erótico, bonito, desde que o sonho seja bom, achei legal pra caramba. E sonhos premonitórios, essa possibilidade que a gente tem de. A história da nota de $5 que ele fala é muito interessante também, né? Que da pessoa achar a nota de $5 no dia seguinte, mas espera aí, né? Achou mesmo, ela realmente sonhou com a nota, porque não é que achou a casa. Não é toda hora que a gente acha $5 no chão. Então, realmente, ela teve um sonho premonitório numa frequência diferente. Aí o Daniel que sabe essas coisas de frequência. E depois ele não falou, mas eu acabei lembrando aqui, compartilhar com vocês, do aquele filme Minority Report, do Spielberg. E tem os precogs, aquelas pessoas que ficam naquele aquário futurista, elas preveem o assassinato que vai acontecer. E eles são chamados de precogs, né, de precognition, né? Então, eles usam o termo no filme. E naquela época também, quando eu assisti o filme, teve muito zum, zum, zum de gente falando que podia ser um precog, caiu no popular nos Estados Unidos, principalmente, essa coisa da precognition. Ele numa hora também ele vai falar uma coisa muito legal sobre essa coisa que a gente perguntou para ele da vida depois da morte. Ele não, isso eu acho muito legal, porque dentro aqui no Brasil a gente tem uma visão um pouco kardecista da vida depois da morte, que é bem nosso lar, né? Pelo que eu penso, ele não disse isso, mas ele fala que ele não sabe como é, né? Isso é interessante, ele não está doutrinando a gente, ele não tem ideia do que seja, né? Fala ainda também daquelas coisas do multiverso, que também agora é moda falar, por causa dos cinemas de novo, e ele diz aqueles espaços entre os átomos, e que esses espaços que vibram podem estar sendo ocupados por outras possibilidades, por outros universos. Eu nunca tinha pensado nisso, eu achei bem maravilhoso isso, né? De como ele encara esse multiverso, esse número de possibilidades de universos. Achei muito incrível, né? Uma pessoa que acho que dá para sentar e a gente ficar conversando com ele horas, porque ele tem um conteúdo muito legal e acho que para psicanálise, que no meu caso, é apaixonante, porque amplia muito o leque de compreensão, né, e de escuta da gente, né, acho, da gente poder ter contato com tanta informação boa. Achei sensacional. Eu virei fã dele, né? E agora, ele fala também de uma coisa muito legal, que quando a gente perguntou sobre como é que você confia num médium, né? No- então, isso é incrível, porque sempre é uma questão. E ele acabou falando da médium de São Francisco, que eu já li sobre isso, que aprontou com todo mundo, ela desacreditava as pessoas. Você falava, tem um espírito na minha casa que é masculino. Ela, não é masculino, é um espírito feminino. Então, ela já chegava com uma propriedade e que a pessoa ficava convencida. Depois ela e o marido dela inventaram que tinha uma mina de ouro em algum lugar para as pessoas investirem dinheiro para saber onde estava a mina. Ela foi muito esperta. Por que eu não pensei nisso antes? Falar que tem uma mina de ouro lá em Cotia, perto da minha casa. Aí as pessoas mandaram o dinheiro, tudo, mas aí o marido dela foi preso. Bom, enfim, é muito interessante como essa coisa do médium que vai para a TV para vender algo que não é, eu não acho que é uma mercadoria vendável, né? Acho que é tão sério isso, então você mexe tanto com a emoção do outro, é muita sacanagem, né? E ele realmente deixa bem claro, não é o bom caminho. E que o médium tem que trabalhar em grupo, ele não vai trabalhar sozinho. Isso ele fala, que ele comenta que os que vêm até ele e trabalham com ele, trabalha em grupo, então não é uma coisa solitária, né? E ele também tem questões muito fortes e potentes e profundas para jogar para o médium, para testar o médium, conversar com ele, mas o trabalho em grupo é fundamental. Achei muito bacana isso também. E agora, quanto às outras culturas, ele tem uma pincelada muito rápida, mas ele foi parar lá na Austrália, com os aborígenes da Austrália, que tem toda uma coisa antropológica aí bacana, e ele estava trabalhando com uma TV japonesa na época para fazer um programa importante aí sobre a área dele, né? Mas aí ele percebe que tem sim algumas questões culturais muito importantes sobre o pós-morte, sobre a cultura vamos dizer, dos espíritos, sobre as lendas, sobre os mitos. Ele dá uma pincelada boa sobre isso, mas não tão profunda, porque eu acho que a área dele está mais centrada mesmo com o que está acontecendo com a empresa dele, né? Onde ele dá aula, as coisas que ele faz nos Estados Unidos, e essa coisa mais Ghostbusters, só que não é Ghostbusters, né? Apesar de ser engraçado, mas é uma coisa bem mais séria e muito mais profunda em termos de identificação dos fenômenos e apuração do que está acontecendo com as pessoas. Mas o legal é saber que poltergeist, na maioria dos casos, é causado por nós, né? Estamos vivos causando o poltergeist, né? Porque o poltergeist não é bem o que o Spielberg fez no filme, né? Com aquelas aparições, aquelas coisas todas que nós vemos do filme e aquela confusão toda, né? A assombração em si, etc. Eu acho que deu uma separada muito boa. Diga, fala, querido.
É o que a Laís acho que tinha. Você quer falar, Laís, que ela falou que precisava sair? E
Ah,
depois...
claro.
Aí a gente volta em você, eu também tenho algumas coisas para falar sobre isso.
Vou pontuar bem rapidinho, achei interessante, pegando esse gancho do Fábio, dessa questão do controle da própria energia psíquica. Eu acho que grande parte dos fenômenos também estão aí, porque eu sou particularmente muito interessada na questão de performance, né? E formas não ortodoxas, né? Através de farmacológicos, de treinamento e tudo mais. Eu achei interessante no caso daquele menino, que ele não queria competir, né, no karatê, depois não queria competir, não queria ser nadador, e eu achei curioso que o grupo do Loyd direcionou ele para um professor de Kung Fu para ele controlar
É,
a
no,
energia do Qi.
é,
Então, assim, nós não estamos acostumados a fazer pesquisas talvez um pouco mais aprofundadas nessas filosofias antigas. Acho que elas têm muito para nos ensinar a respeito disso, do uso da nossa própria energia psíquica, porque, novamente, né, o Lloyd faz essa diferenciação muito boa entre apparitions, né, que seriam, vamos dizer assim, essa questão dos fenômenos que se manifestam fora do corpo, da consciência, que não necessariamente são pessoas falecidas, no caso, se fosse no espiritismo, desencarnadas, né? e o que seriam os fantasmas, né? Eu acho que essa diferenciação para quem está iniciando aí nos fenômenos anômalos na parapsicologia é muito importante. Então, acho que também são poucos os estudos feitos em relação a isso, né? Achei muito curioso ele direcionar para um professor de Kung Fu que pudesse fazer com que o menino direcionasse bem sua própria energia, né? Para ver aí que de repente tem coisas dentro da psicologia que não são talvez tão divulgadas ou trabalhadas, né? Até mesmo a nível acadêmico. Achei bem interessante. Outra questão que eu achei curiosa foi essa questão da vibração, né? Quando ele comentou ali na última questão a respeito das vibrações, de certos acessos a possíveis universos, outras dimensões, essa questão da frequência, às vezes foi muito popularizado e vulgarizado também alguns conceitos relativos a isso. Tem a questão da física quântica, que tem pessoas que acham um pouco indigesto misturar junto com psicologia, né, as filosofias da nova era também, mas eu acho que tem algo curioso aí que poderia ser pesquisado de maneira mais aprofundada. E para finalizar, né, eu sou fã de antropologia, eu já estive também na Austrália e eu achei assim fantástico ele, claro, né, fez um estudo assim muito incipiente com os aborígenes australianos, mas novamente, eu acho que esses povos têm muito para nos ensinar a respeito. A gente muitas vezes se apropria de uma camada superficial, porque obviamente nós não estamos inseridos no contexto deles, né? De, vamos dizer, aquisição do conhecimento, acomodação do conhecimento. A gente já quer a cereja do bolo, sem passar por outras fases, assim, vamos dizer assim, né? Desses processos de aprendizagem que eles vão fazendo ao longo dos anos. Eu acho interessante a gente, de repente, em outro encontro, falar um pouquinho mais a respeito disso. Eu sou muito interessada também nessa questão dos povos originários. Acho que o Loyd deu só uma pincelada, né? Mas, de repente, é uma abertura para a gente poder conversar um pouquinho mais. É isso.
Com certeza, muito legal.
Ah, só mais uma questão, para finalizar, que eu me lembrei aqui, que a gente começa a lembrar, né? Eu achei fascinante uma questão. Quando o indivíduo chega num ambiente, ele sente uma sensação de bem-estar, ou mal-estar, né? E, de repente, me senti mal no ambiente. Novamente, essa questão da captação das energias que estão, as energias psíquicas, assim, de catexia, né? Energia psíquica. Eu acredito muito nisso. Inclusive, eu tinha feito um trabalho a respeito de espaços geopsíquicos. Eu não conhecia esse termo, né? Eu me apropriei dele porque eu acho que foi outra pessoa que tinha lançado num livro, usei num estudo. Eu acredito que, de repente, ele usou imprint, né? É como se essas energias elas ficassem impressas no ambiente. E algumas pessoas, quando elas estão talvez um pouco mais harmonizadas, elas sentem de maneira mais fácil, né? Elas têm esse canal de leitura, vamos dizer assim, aberto para poder fazer essa leitura dos ambientes nos quais elas passam. Eu achei um outro ponto super interessante também, eu não sei se o Daniel ele poderia, porque eu acho que tem um termo para isso, né? Dentro
É
dos fenômenos, como se chama?
a psicometria.
Psicometria, exatamente. Acho curioso também, eu acho bem interessante esse ponto que ele trouxe na nossa conversa.
Seria um tipo de mediunidade onde alguém consegue detectar a história emocional de um ambiente, de pessoas, né? Quer dizer, pessoas que nas suas vidas geraram printings, né? Quer dizer, impressões no ambiente, em objetos, e alguém com esse objeto em mãos ou dentro desse ambiente conseguiria reconstituir o que aconteceu, porque esse passado está presente energeticamente, ele ficou gravado ali.
Energia.
Exatamente, ele ficou gravado.
A gente às vezes visita um lugar histórico, né? A gente pensa quantos eventos ocorreram aqui, quantas ou brigas, ou guerras, ou reencontros, tudo mais. Então é fascinante esse tema. Então algumas pessoas talvez consigam a um nível mais profundo fazer essa leitura e a gente de repente um nível um pouco mais superficial. Mas eu acho que é isso. foram os pontos que eu achei interessantes.
Legal. Alguém gostaria de continuar?
Eu não sabia que tinha esse nome de psicometria, né? Quando eu estudei psicologia, a gente fez uma visita no Carandiru antes dele ser implodido, né? E só estava o pavilhão 9 ocupado, o restante tinha sido desocupado já. Então, aquela sensação de entrar e sentir cheiro, atmosfera, energia. Então, bem isso mesmo que a gente está falando, né? Do imprinting, né? Que ele falou. Então, isso é muito interessante, né? E de sentir o bem-estar ou o mal-estar, ou de alguma coisa isso te tocar, de alguma forma isso te tocar, né? Então, isso é uma coisa muito curiosa, né? Muito interessante.
Você está
Sem microfone, sem som.
A Alessandra está com o microfone fechado.
Eu tô pensando alto aqui na fala dela, né? Ela tá dizendo da afetação, né? Me afeta, né? Eu só complementei, né? Trouxe a palavra. Eu fiquei só que o Fábio já falou, né? Eu acho que me chamou a atenção que o parâmetro que ele tem, além de toda a pesquisa, que ele também investiga se a pessoa é boa, ele fala assim, né? Ele ainda fala assim, se a pessoa é boa, eu achei isso fantástico, assim, ele tentar pegar o que está em jogo dentro daquele fornecimento libidinal, sensorial, mediúnico, enfim, né? E isso fazer parte do que da pesquisa. Eu achei isso lindíssimo. Só a complementação.
Uhum. A resposta dele foi ótima, né? Como confiar num médium, né? Como, a mesma pergunta, como confiar numa pessoa, né? Assim, por que que o médium ele seria de menos crédito do que uma pessoa que pode te enganar também, né? Então, médiums são pessoas. Agora, é curioso a história que ele contou da menina que estava sendo bulinada, né? Pelo que eu entendi,
Uhum,
pelo espírito de um homem.
uhum,
E aí depois acabaram confirmando que esse homem existia na vizinhança e era um pedófilo, né?
uhum. E esse tipo de coisa que acho que é o que mais assusta, né? Porque ainda mais mexendo com a criança, e a criança com aquelas risadinhas, com aquelas cócegas, aquele lalangue que ela acaba falando, o que está acontecendo com essa criança? Quem está abusando dela? É alguém da família? É alguém de perto? Aí depois descobre-se que o cara que morreu é praticamente quem a criança acredita que através de índices, né? Através de possibilidades que as pessoas vão mostrando, essa pessoa, não é essa aqui. Nossa, é muito forte isso, né? Que deve acontecer no mundo todo, é que talvez lá, já que a parapsicologia é levada a sério desta forma, poder se examinar um fenômeno como esse é de uma importância crucial, exatamente para poder esclarecer. É isso que eu entendo desse ritmo todo que ele traz para a gente, né, dessas novidades. E não poder acusar ninguém, podiam acusar qualquer pessoa, concorda? Né? Ia ser uma confusão geral, mas descobre-se que não, né, que é realmente quem ainda não partiu, o cara já morreu, mas o cara está lá ainda, perpetrando as mesmas atividades, as mesmas ações. É assustador, né? Uma história, nossa, a gente
As
fica
mesmas ações depois de morto, né?
às vezes ações depois de morto, né? É muito interessante, muito.
Assim, foi interessante você ter comentado esse ponto, Fábio, porque realmente eu acho que tanto a parapsicologia como a ufologia, elas não é que são exclusivas dos Estados Unidos, né? Tem na
Hum,
Europa também, no mundo todo, né? Mas assim, a cultura americana,
hum,
ela acho que dá mais abertura,
sim,
não para a vida, não para a crença na vida após a morte e tal, né? Mas para isso ser tratado dessa forma
exato, exato.
através de estudos, né? Porque tem muito dinheiro lá, tem muita
É,
pesquisa. Por exemplo, se você for ver quais são as pesquisas empíricas, né, no Brasil em parapsicologia, né? É incomparável, né, com o
é,
volume. esse material que tem nos Estados Unidos, né? A mesma coisa a ufologia lá, né? Quer dizer, e tá tudo misturado com uma espécie de mística do governo americano, né? Os projetos Stargate, projeto
Uhum.
Book, né? Que seria a exploração dessas pautas, né? Do ponto de vista dos interesses, né? Do governo dos Estados Unidos, né? Então, tem toda uma atmosfera, não que não seja verdade, né? Mas acho que tem tudo a ver com American culture, né? E que os outros países eles têm, parece que uma aproximação meio tímida perto do alcance que isso tem lá nos Estados Unidos, né? Não sei se vocês têm essa impressão também.
Sabe o que que eu tenho
Eu,
a impressão? Ai, desculpa, acho que eu ia.
não, fala, pode
Não,
falar.
eu acho que nós temos uma abertura a nível de crença, experiência religiosa em relação a esses fenômenos, e eu acho que nos Estados Unidos, no sentido como eu estava falando de performance,
Uhum.
eles pegam essa nata do que pode ser interessante, talvez a nível militar, a nível de governo, porque se esses fenômenos supostamente existem, né, como a gente pode se apropriar disso para melhorar criar um Übermensch, um super-homem, vamos dizer assim, né? Um homem que pode tudo, que pode ir acima das suas capacidades, né? Então, esse tipo de informação, ela tem dinheiro, né? Ela, vamos dizer assim, ela pode render, ela é lucrativa, né? Essa informação. Então, eu acho que é mais ou menos nesse nível. A gente acredita sem ter embasamento acadêmico, talvez, né? O brasileiro, porque é sincrético, né? Nós somos esse
Isso.
melting pot, essa mistura. E eu acho que eles é nesse nível de investimento mesmo, sabe? Muitos países eu acho que já estão super avançados nisso. Um é a China, né? E como o Daniel mencionou antes, é a União Soviética e os Estados Unidos. A União Soviética, principalmente se a gente for trazer, né, literatura aqui para conversar, fizeram muitas experiências também. Acho bastante interessante.
Só para complementar, né, que ele não disse isso, mas só para completar esse pensamento bacana da Laís, a gente tem, historicamente aqui, né, muitos livros e muito material dos nazistas se interessarem tremendamente em parapsicologia, porque vamos dizer assim, do ponto de vista armamentista, é uma arma potente, né? Se a gente pensar, né, num conceito bem divertido, vamos lá, temos um filme lindo, Indiana Jones e os Caçadores da Arca Perdida, né? Então, você tem os nazistas interessados na parapsicologia e tem muita coisa interessante, muito livro, muita literatura nos Estados Unidos, documentada, real mesmo, dos interesses dos nazistas na parapsicologia em si. É interessantíssimo isso, né? Então, mas para ver esse lado belicoso da coisa, como eu posso me proteger do inimigo e aprontar mais ainda para o inimigo, né? Vendo de uma forma belicosa. Daí tem o dinheiro e a possibilidade de fazer essa ciência ser literalmente considerada como tal, né? É bem legal, é interessantíssimo isso.
Sociedade vril, né? Do
Exato.
nazismo, né?
É
Eles
muito
têm uma
interessante, muito bem
sociedade
visto.
com esse perfil.
Muito bem visto, isso aí.
A Sônia estava tentando falar aquela hora.
Eu tenho tanta
Tadinha,
coisa para
Eu
falar que eu
vi.
estou até meio muda. Mas não, eu só ia comentar nesse tema que nós estamos discutindo, que para mim me parece um pouco contraditório que o Brasil, que é um país tão espiritualizado, tem tantas religiões, raízes africanas com religiões, Umbanda, Candomblé, etc. Espiritismo é muito divulgado no Brasil e é ainda visto com tanto preconceito todos esses fenômenos parapsicológicos, né? É muito difícil você ser credibilizado quando você conta alguma coisa, né? Por isso que me custou tantos anos abrir o meu baú e tirar as minhas experiências para fora, que é realmente impressionante o preconceito que existe aqui. E eu me lembrei de uma outra coisa que nós estávamos falando anteriormente, de manifestações de espíritos que morreram. Eu tenho uma das minhas filhas que, quando tinha uns 3 anos de idade, começou a acordar de noite e me chamar chorando, que ela não conseguia dormir porque o menino pulava na cama dela e não deixava ela pegar no sono. ou acordava ela durante o sono. E isso aconteceu muitas noites. Ela tinha uns 3 anos, mais ou menos. E tanto que eu chamei a minha secretária do consultório, que era da Umbanda Branca. Pedi para ela vir lá em casa para dar uma olhada, para ver o que ela achava. E quando ela estava lá no quarto da minha filha, ela incorporou algum espírito que viu. A minha filha dizia que era um menino. Ela viu uma criança, o tal do espírito incorporado viu uma criança, teve um papo com essa criança e disse que ali não era mais o lugar dele, era um menino, que ele estava fazendo uma travessura imperdoável, que ele estava vindo para cá e perturbando uma criança viva, e que ele já estava em outro plano. Então, disseram que iam levá-lo de volta para onde ele tinha que ir, e a partir daquele dia, nunca mais a minha filha acordou à noite contando nada. Foi um fato muito impressionante que aconteceu lá em casa. Me lembrei disso.
Interessante, você que vai trazer em breve a segunda parte, né, Sônia, do teu relato aqui no canal.
Eu confesso que eu estou um pouco apreensiva, viu, Daniel? Porque eu já estava apreensiva antes com tudo que eu contei. Agora, então, falar de vidas passadas vai me deixar mais apreensiva ainda.
Então, temos que providenciar logo esse vídeo para essa sua apreensão. Sim,
Antes que eu fuja.
mas já estamos dando uma palhinha aqui, né? Já estamos.
É,
Pessoal, eu vou pedir licença para abandoná-los. Foi um prazer enorme estar aqui. Dani, obrigado pela oportunidade. Foi muito bacana. Adorei conhecer aí todo mundo. Tem uns que eu não tinha visto ainda. Foi um prazer estar aqui, viu, pessoal? Muito legal mesmo. Obrigado, viu? Tá bom? Valeu de
obrigada,
novo, Dani.
Fábio.
A
Obrigado
gente que agradece
pela
você,
tradução,
Fábio.
obrigado pela presença e pela
Pessoal,
tradução.
obrigada pela oportunidade.
Tchau, obrigado.
Tchau, tchau. Bom, alguém quer fazer algum comentário final, pessoal?
Eu também adorei o Loyd, achei ele muito simpático, muito aberto, assim, muito legal, gostei demais. Pena que o meu inglês está enclenque, então eu não entendi tudo, mas depois eu vou colocar. Vai ter
Isso,
uma legendinha, né?
eu vou providenciar a legendagem, também vou procurar propiciar o inverso do português para o inglês também, né? Para quem é de língua
Em
inglesa
inglês.
poder nos entender, né?
Aham.
Então, acho que é isso. Vamos talvez encerrar, né? Momento de já temos bastante conteúdo e para deixar também com aquele gostinho de quero mais, que seja o início aí de muitos encontros internacionais aqui no canal com o nosso coletivo Ativismo Insólito, né?
Peraí, meu neto aqui me interrompendo, já estão me chamando.
Legal,
Preciso.
pessoal, quem tiver interesse em entrar em contato com o canal gaiatapsi23@gmail.com, para quem quiser dar relato de experiência anômala, nós temos vários vídeos aqui no canal, sem juízos de valor, sem estigmas, sem diagnósticos. Nós vamos ter o prazer em acolher vocês. Podem entrar em contato conosco. Quem também quiser fazer parte do nosso coletivo, tem um grupo de WhatsApp, Ativismo Insólito, pode também mandar um contato nesse e-mail. Eu sou Daniel Hammer-Roisman, psicólogo e psicanalista. Estamos aqui hoje com mais membros do coletivo Ativismo Insólito, Desdobramentos do Campo do Estranho. Muito obrigado pela presença até agora e até breve com mais novidades aqui no canal.